Ilara was a ghost, a whisper of a girl in a world of roaring wolves. She was classified as wolfless, an omega of the Blood Moon Pack, which was a sentence worse than death. It meant she was less than nothing, a creature of utility, born to scrub floors and endure the casual cruelty of those blessed by the moon goddess with a second form. Her existence was a tapestry woven from the threads of pain, hunger, and a bone-deep cold that had nothing to do with the wind that rattled the thin walls of her shack. Each day was a mirror of the last, a cycle of menial labor under the sneering gaze of her betters, their insults like stones against her ribs. Her hands were raw, chapped from the harsh lye soap she used to scrub the packhouse floors until they gleamed. The scent of bleach was permanently etched into her skin, a chemical shroud that masked the faint, wild scent of rain-soaked earth and crushed wildflowers that was uniquely hers. She kept her head down, her silver-gray eyes fixed on the grime she was tasked to erase. To look up was to invite trouble. To meet the eyes of Seraphina, the pack alpha's daughter, was to ask for a slap or a kick. Seraphina, with her cruel beauty and venomous tongue, made Ilara's suffering her personal sport. But the physical torment was a dull ache compared to the terror that lived in her heart. For Ilara had a secret with wide, curious eyes the color of a twilight sky, and a laugh that was the only music in her desolate world. His name was Finn. He was 4 years old, and he was her son. He was the reason she endured, the reason she scrubbed until her knuckles bled, the reason she swallowed every insult and hid every tear. He was her everything. Finn was also the reason she lived in perpetual, apocalyptic fear. He was not like other children. Sometimes, when he was startled or upset, the air around him would crackle. Toys would float for a half-second before clattering to the floor. Once, a stray dog had snarled at him, and an invisible force had slammed it into a wall, leaving it whimpering and broken. Ilara knew, with a certainty that froze her blood, that this power was dangerous. It was a beacon in the dark, and if Alpha Marcus ever discovered it, he would see Finn not as a child, but as a threat, or a weapon. Both outcomes were a death sentence, so she hid him. She kept him in their small, dilapidated shack at the furthest edge of the pack territory, telling him stories of monsters to keep him from wandering. She muffled his accidental bursts of power with her own body, absorbing the strange, tingling energy until it left her dizzy and weak. She was chaining a hurricane inside a glass jar, and she knew the glass was cracking. The inciting incident arrived not with a bang, but with a proclamation, nailed to the great oak in the center of the pack square. The Alpha King, Kalen the Unforgiving, was coming. His name was a legend, a horror story told to unruly pups. He was the Alpha of Alphas, ruler of all territories, a warrior king who had carved his empire from the blood and bone of his enemies. He had not visited a minor pack like Blood Moon in decades. His arrival was an omen. The proclamation mandated a pack-wide assembly. Every single member, from the Alpha to the lowest Omega, was required to present themselves. No exceptions. No excuses. Ilara's heart stopped. She could not hide. And she could not bring Finn. The king's power was said to be so immense, he could scent a lie from a mile away and sense power like a hound senses blood. He would see the truth of her son. The secret she had protected with her very life was about to be torn from her grasp. Despair, cold and absolute, settled over her. She was out of time. The day of the king's arrival dawned gray and oppressive. The very air felt heavy, charged with a manic energy that set every wolf on edge. Ilara felt it like a physical weight on her shoulders, a premonition of doom. She had hidden Finn in a small, hollowed-out space beneath the floorboards of their shack, with a stale piece of bread and a flask of water. She had kissed his brow, her tears falling on his sleeping face, and whispered a desperate prayer to a goddess who had long ago abandoned her. King Kalen arrived like a storm front. He didn't ride in a carriage. He walked at the head of his royal guard, their black and silver armor gleaming. He was a giant of a man, well over 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders as broad as a doorway. His face was all harsh angles and brutal beauty, as if carved from granite by a merciless god. A jagged scar cut through one dark eyebrow, a testament to a life of lethal violence. But it was his eyes that held the true terror. They were the color of molten gold, blazing with an ancient predatory intelligence that seemed to strip away all pretense and peer directly into your soul. His power rolled off him in palpable waves, a crushing pressure that forced the air from Alara's lungs and made the ground itself seem to tremble. He was a king, a god, a walking apocalypse. His gaze swept over the assembled pack, dismissive and cold. He was a creature of absolute authority, and the wolves of Blood Moon, including their arrogant Alpha Marcus, bowed their heads in submission. He was searching for something, his golden eyes scanning face after face. A deep, primal ache radiated from his chest, the same hollow ache he'd carried for a century, the gnawing emptiness of a wolf without his mate. His wolf, a beast of shadow and fury, was restless, pacing the cage of his ribs, scenting the air for a hint of something that was missing. Alara tried to make herself smaller, to fade into the miserable huddle of Omegas at the very back of the assembly. She pulled her threadbare shawl tighter, hoping to smother her own unique scent of rain and wild flowers. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird beating its wings against a cage. She just needed to survive this. She needed to get back to Finn. But fate, in its infinite cruelty, had other plans. Seraphina, spotting Alara's attempt at invisibility, glided through the crowd. Her lips were curled in a triumphant sneer. "Trying to hide, little rat?" she hissed, her voice dripping with poison. "The king demands everyone be present. That includes worthless, wolfless filth like you." Before Alara could react, Seraphina's hand shot out, her fingers tangling painfully in Alara's matted hair. With a vicious yank, she dragged Alara from the back of the crowd, stumbling and crying out, and threw her onto the ground at the very front of the assembly, directly in the path of the Alpha King. Alara landed hard on the packed earth, the impact jarring her bones. Humiliation burned hot in her cheeks. The pack members snickered, their scorn a familiar lash against her spirit. She scrambled to her knees, keeping her eyes down, her hair falling like a curtain to hide her face. She prayed he would just pass her by, that he would dismiss her as the insect she was meant to be. But he stopped. The crushing weight of his presence intensified, focused entirely on her. The world went silent. The snickering died. The only sound was the frantic beat of her own heart. Slowly, terrified, she lifted her head. Their eyes met. For King Kalen, the world fractured. A scent, intoxicating and forbidden, slammed into him like a physical blow. Rain-soaked earth, crushed wildflowers, and something else. Something pure and powerful, like moonlight given form. It was the scent he had dreamed of, the scent his soul had craved for 100 lonely years. It cut through the stench of the subservient pack, a singular, perfect note in a cacophony of noise. His golden eyes locked onto the kneeling Omega, onto her wide, terrified, silver-gray eyes. His wolf rose up within him, a feral god awakened from slumber, and roared a single possessive word that echoed in the marrow of his bones. Mine. For Alara, the connection was a lightning strike. A dizzying, terrifying warmth flooded her veins, chasing away the perpetual cold for the first time in her life. It was a magnetic pull, a force of nature that demanded she rise, that she go to him. It felt like coming home to a place she had never been. The terror was still there, a frantic scream in the back of her mind, but it was now tangled with a new, bewildering emotion, a sense of belonging. She saw not just a king, but a protector. not just a tyrant, but a sanctuary. Her soul recognized his before her mind could even process the impossibility of it all. The most powerful man in the world, the Alpha King, was her mate. And she was a wolfless Omega with a secret that could get them all killed. King Kalen took a step forward, his entire being singularly focused on the woman at his feet. The world around them had ceased to exist. There was only her scent, her eyes, the frantic pulse he could see beating in the delicate skin of her throat. He wanted to touch her, to wrap her in his arms and spirit her away from this wretched place. He wanted to burn the world down for every tear she had ever shed. Alpha Marcus, seeing the king's dangerous focus on the pack's lowest member, felt a surge of panic and fury. This Omega was a stain on his pack's honor. For the king to show any interest in her was a direct insult to him and, more importantly, to his daughter Seraphina, whom he had hoped to offer to the king as a potential mate. He had to sever this connection, to humiliate Ilara so thoroughly that the king would be disgusted. "Your Majesty," Marcus began, his voice slick with false deference as he stepped forward, deliberately placing himself between Kalen and Ilara. "Pay this creature no mind. She is a wolfless Omega, a disgrace to our pack. Worse, she is sullied." He let the word hang in the air, heavy and poisonous. "She has a bastard pup, Your Majesty. A child of unknown origin." The words were a physical blow to Ilara. She flinched, her blood running cold. "No, not Finn. Please, not Finn." Seraphina seized the opportunity, her voice high and cruel. "That's right. She hides the little freak away in her hovel. Bring it out. Show the king the Omega's shame." A sick, triumphant smile spread across Marcus's face. This was perfect. He would expose her completely. He barked an order to two of his guards. "Go to the Omega's shack at the edge of the territory. You will find a child hidden there. Bring him to me." Ilara's world tilted on its axis. A feral, protective instinct she didn't know she possessed surged through her. "No!" The word was torn from her throat, a raw, desperate sound. She tried to scramble to her feet, to run, to do anything, but a guard slammed a heavy boot onto her back, pinning her to the dirt. King Kalen's golden eyes narrowed to lethal slits. The temperature dropped by 20 degrees. A low, menacing growl rumbled in his chest, a sound like shifting tectonic plates. He had not given an order. This provincial alpha was acting without his permission, and he was threatening the woman who smelled like his destiny. He was about to intervene, to rip the alpha's throat out for his insolence, but a flicker of movement from the edge of the woods caught his eye. The guards were already returning, dragging a small, struggling bundle between them. They threw the child onto the ground near Ilara. Finn, his face streaked with dirt and tears, looked around in terror, his small body trembling. His twilight-colored eyes found his mother's, and he whimpered, "Mama." That single word shattered Ilara's control. Every ounce of her being screamed to protect him. Marcus loomed over the boy, a predator enjoying his power. "See, Your Majesty? The Omega's whelp. A worthless half-breed, no doubt." To punctuate his disgust, he turned to the guard who had pinned Ilara. "Teach the Omega a lesson in obedience. Strike the child." This was the point of no return. The guard, eager to please his alpha, raised a calloused, meaty hand to backhand the small boy. Ilara screamed, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony, but the blow never landed. Just as the guard's hand began its descent, a wave of pure, shimmering silver energy erupted from Finn. It was not a physical blast, but a psychic one, a silent, concussive force that slammed into the guard, lifting him off his feet and throwing him a dozen yards through the air. He crashed into the great oak with a sickening crunch of bone and lay still. A collective, horrified gasp swept through the pack. The air crackled with residual power. Finn stood trembling, his small hands glowing with a faint silver light, his eyes wide with fear and confusion at what he had just done. The secret was out. It was more spectacular and more terrifying than Alara had ever imagined, but the revelation was not over. Seeing the lingering threat in Alpha Marcus's eyes as he stared at her son, something inside Alara broke. The years of abuse, the constant fear, the desperate love for her child, it all coalesced into a singular, incandescent point of rage. The carefully constructed dam she had built around her own power did not just crack. It was obliterated in a tidal wave of apocalyptic fury. She rose to her feet, the guard's boot suddenly as meaningless as a fallen leaf on her back. A silver light, far more intense and powerful than Finn's, began to pour from her. It was not the soft glow of her son's power. It was the blinding, cold light of the full moon. The ground beneath her feet began to frost over, despite the mild day. Her drab gray eyes bled into pure, luminous silver. "You will not touch my son," she said, and her voice was no longer the timid whisper of an Omega. It was a multitonal chorus, the voice of an ancient and terrible power, a voice that promised utter annihilation. Then she shifted. It was not the messy, violent transformation of a normal werewolf. There was no cracking of bones or tearing of flesh. Light consumed her. When it receded, where the broken Omega had stood, there was a wolf. But it was a wolf of legend, a creature from the oldest stories. It was enormous, larger than any wolf Kalen had ever seen, larger even than his own royal form. Its fur was the color of fresh fallen snow, so white it seemed to radiate its own light. Its eyes were molten silver, burning with the fury of the moon goddess herself. This was no mere wolf. This was the lunar wolf, the direct descendant of the goddess, a queen of their people thought lost to myth and time. She was not wolfless, she was the mother of all wolves. The entire Blood Moon pack fell to their knees as one, not in respect, but in primal, instinctual terror. This was a being of divine power, a living deity, and they had spent years torturing her. Alpha Marcus stared, his face a mask of disbelief and horror, his arrogance incinerated by the sheer holy power radiating from the great white wolf. Seraphina let out a choked sob of terror, finally understanding the catastrophic scale of her mistake. The great white wolf took a step toward Marcus, a growl rumbling from her chest that sounded like an avalanche. She was going to tear him apart. She was going to erase him and his entire bloodline from existence for threatening her pup. King Kalen moved faster than thought. He was beside her in an instant, not as a man, but as a king. His own power, a crushing darkness that felt like the gravity of a dying star, flared to life, a counterpoint to her lunar brilliance. He placed a hand gently on the massive wolf's shoulder, a gesture of impossible bravery. The divine fur was cool to the touch, like silk and starlight. He leaned in close, his lips near her massive, tufted ear. The entire world held its breath, waiting to see if the lunar wolf would rip their king to shreds. In the sudden, ringing silence, he whispered, his voice a low, urgent command meant only for her. "They will die for this. I swear it on my life. But not like this. Let the world see your justice, my queen." Then he looked at the glowing child who was now staring at his mother in awe. He added the words that would change everything, the words that would offer a shield of absolute protection and seal their fate forever. "Say the child is mine." It was a command, a plea, and a promise all in one. It was a masterful political move, a declaration of alliance, and the truest vow a mate could make. He was claiming not only her, but her son, shielding him with the unassailable power of the royal line. Alara, even in her divine rage, understood. The fury receded just enough for clarity to return. She looked at Kaelin, her mate, who stood beside her without a trace of fear, only fierce, unwavering support. She looked at her son, who needed a father and a protector. And she looked at her tormentors, who deserved not a quick death, but a cold, public justice. Slowly, majestically, the great white wolf nodded. She shifted back, the silver light coalescing until she stood once more as a woman. But she was not the same woman. The meek Omega was gone, burned away in the light of the goddess. In her place stood a queen, her silver eyes blazing with power, her posture radiating an authority that dwarfed Kaelin's own. Kaelin's wolf was howling in triumph. He had found her. His mate was not just a mate. She was a legend reborn, a true queen. His reaction, in the face of this divine revelation, was as instinctual as breathing. Before the shocked eyes of the entire Lycan world, the Alpha King, Kaelin the Unforgiving, a man who had never bowed to anyone, dropped to one knee. He bowed his head to his mate, to his queen. The collective gasp of the onlookers was sharp enough to cut glass. An Alpha King did not kneel, ever. For him to do so was a fundamental reordering of their universe. It was the ultimate validation of her status. He was not just her mate, he was her first and most powerful subject. Without rising, Kaelin issued his first command in her name. His voice was no longer just authoritative, it was lethal, edged with the promise of apocalyptic violence. "Gideon," he said, his golden eyes fixed on his beta, who stood ready among the royal guard. "Your Majesty," Gideon replied, his own voice tight with awe. "Take the queen and the prince to the Alpha's manor. Secure the royal suite. Allow no one near them. Use lethal force if necessary." He deliberately used her new titles, cementing them in the minds of all who heard. Queen, Prince. The words echoed in the stunned silence. Gideon and 4 of the elite royal guard moved immediately, forming a protective diamond around Alara and Finn. Gideon bowed low. "My queen, if you would come with us." Alara, still reeling from the torrent of power and emotion, looked down at Kaelin, then at her son. Finn ran to her, burying his face in her worn dress. She scooped him into her arms, holding him tight. The feel of his small body against hers was the only anchor in this swirling vortex of change. She gave a small, hesitant nod to Gideon. As the guards escorted her away from the square, she could feel the burning hatred of Seraphina and the stark terror of Alpha Marcus on her back. But for the first time, it didn't make her afraid. It made her feel a cold, satisfying certainty. Their time was over. Kaelin remained on one knee until she was out of sight. Only then did he rise, his movements slow and deliberate. He turned to face Alpha Marcus, and the mask of the cold, controlled king was gone. In its place was the face of a feral predator whose mate had been harmed. His golden eyes were no longer molten, they were twin supernovas of incandescent rage. "Alpha Marcus of the Blood Moon Pack." Kaelin's voice was deceptively soft, a quiet hiss that was more terrifying than any shout. "You have committed treason against the crown. You have abused and tortured your rightful queen, the living vessel of the goddess, and you threatened her son, my son, the prince." He let the lie settle, the lie that was now the most absolute truth in their world. Marcus's face had gone ashen. He began to stammer, to plead. "Your Majesty, I did not know. How could I have known? She was wolfless, an Omega. It was a mistake." "A mistake?" Kaelin took a step forward, and Marcus scrambled backward, falling to the ground. "You mistake a goddess for dirt? You mistake a queen for a slave?" He gestured to the pack, still kneeling in terror. "Your entire pack is complicit. They watched, they laughed, they participated." His voice dropped to a whisper. "This pack is a disease, and I am the cure." He turned to the rest of his royal guard. "Seize Alpha Marcus and his daughter. Confine them to the dungeons. Take statements from every member of this pack. Anyone found to have laid a hand on their queen will be brought to justice. The command was absolute. The guards moved with brutal efficiency, dragging the screaming Serafina and the babbling Marcus away. The transition from a dirt-floored shack to the Alpha's manor was dizzying. The royal suite was a world of soft carpets, polished wood, and warm, fire-lit spaces. It was larger than her entire hovel, filled with luxuries she couldn't have imagined. Gideon and the guards stood watch outside, their presence a silent, unbreachable wall. Finn, his initial fear fading, looked around with wide-eyed wonder. He touched a velvet curtain, his small hand still faintly glowing. Alara set him down and knelt before him, taking his hands in hers. "Are you all right, my love?" "You were a big doggy, Mama," he whispered, his eyes full of awe. "A pretty white doggy." Tears welled in Alara's eyes. "Yes, I was. All the years of hiding, of pretending, of being less than she was, all to protect him. And now, the truth was free." She hugged him tightly, breathing in the scent of him, the only thing that felt real in this new, unbelievable life. A short time later, Kalen entered the suite. He had changed from his travel leathers into a simple black tunic and trousers. The raw, kingly power still clung to him, but the apocalyptic rage in his eyes had softened to a fierce, protective warmth as he looked at her. He carried a tray with food: roasted meat, fresh bread, a pitcher of milk for Finn. He set it down on a low table. He approached her slowly, as if she were a wild thing he was afraid of spooking. "Are you harmed?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. Alara shook her head, clutching Finn closer. "No, I am all right." His golden eyes searched her face. "For years you have endured this, alone." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, laced with a self-loathing so profound it was almost a physical force. "My mate was suffering, and I did not know. I was not here to protect you." "You are here now," she whispered, the words surprising her. He finally closed the distance between them, dropping to his knees before her and Finn. It was a posture of supplication, of utter devotion. He gently reached out, his large calloused hand hovering near her cheek before he seemed to think better of it. Instead, he looked at Finn. The prophecy of the lunar wolf spoke of a mate, the Shadow King, whose line was as old as hers. Kalen explained, his voice low and steady. It foretold that their union would produce an heir of unprecedented power, a child who would balance the light and the dark. "That is your son, Alara. That is our son. His power is a perfect fusion of our bloodlines." It was a fire hose of information, lore, and prophecy she had never dreamed of. She was a goddess. He was a king of shadow, and their child was the subject of ancient legend. It was too much to absorb. "Why did you hide?" he asked softly. "Your power. It is divine. You could have destroyed them all at any time." "And put a target on his back?" she replied, her voice fierce as she stroked Finn's hair. "I would have lived 1,000 years as a slave to keep him safe. My power meant nothing if it brought him harm." Understanding, raw and profound, dawned in Kalen's eyes. He had spent his life thinking of power as a weapon for conquest and control. She had used divinity as a shield to protect her child. In that moment, his respect for her eclipsed even the overwhelming pull of the mate bond. He was in the presence of a strength far greater than his own. "You will never have to hide again," he vowed, his voice thick with emotion. "I will build a world where he is worshipped, not hunted. Where you are revered, not reviled. This I swear." The tribunal was convened the next day in the Pack's Great Hall. It was a grim, formal affair. Kalen sat on the Alpha's throne, a seat of power carved from ancient oak. But beside it, another, even more ornate chair had been placed. Alara sat there, dressed in a simple but elegant gown of dark blue that one of the king's attendants had provided. She held Finn on her lap, his small hand clutching hers. Her silver eyes were calm and cold as she looked out at the assembled pack. Alpha Marcus and a weeping Seraphina were dragged before the thrones in chains. They looked broken, their arrogance stripped away, leaving only pathetic, sniveling fear. Dozens of other pack members stood behind them, those who had been identified as her most prominent tormentors. Kalen stood. His voice boomed through the hall, imbued with the absolute power of the Alpha King. Justice is not a concept to be debated, it is a debt to be paid. He turned his gaze to Marcus. You were entrusted with the care of a pack. Instead, you fostered cruelty. You allowed the sacred to be defiled. You raised your hand against a child of the royal line. He paused, letting the weight of the accusation settle. For these crimes of treason, the penalty is death. Marcus collapsed, begging for his life. Kalen ignored him, his gaze shifting to Seraphina. You, daughter of Marcus, you took pleasure in the suffering of your queen. Your heart is a pit of jealousy and spite. You are a poison in the blood of our people. His voice was utterly without mercy. You will share your father's fate. He then addressed the other guilty pack members, sentencing them according to their crimes. Some were exiled, stripped of their names and cast out into the wild to fend for themselves. Others were sentenced to years of hard labor, rebuilding the pack they had helped to corrupt. The justice was swift, brutal, and absolute. But when it came to Marcus and Seraphina, Kalen turned and looked at Alara. My queen, he said, his voice now gentle for her ears only. The final sentence is yours to deliver. It is your right. Alara looked down at the two people who had made her life a living hell. She saw no remorse in their eyes, only fear for themselves. She felt the ghost of every blow, the sting of every insult. She thought of the cold, the hunger, the constant terror she had felt for her son. A part of her, the wounded Omega, wanted them to suffer as she had suffered. But as she looked at Finn, who watched the proceedings with a child's solemn curiosity, she knew she could not be the monster they were. She was a mother. She was a queen. Her reign would not begin with vengeance, but with justice. She met Kalen's gaze and gave a single, almost imperceptible shake of her head. She would not speak the words herself. Her silence was its own judgment. Kalen understood. He nodded, a look of fierce pride in his eyes. He turned back to the condemned. The sentence stands, he declared. It will be carried out at sunset. He gestured to the guards. Take them away. As Marcus and Seraphina were dragged from the hall, their screams for mercy echoing off the stone walls, a new era began. The age of the Lunar Queen and her Shadow King. That night, after the executions had been carried out, and a pall of grim silence had fallen over the pack, Alara stood in the royal suite, looking out the window at the rising moon. Kalen had appointed a temporary alpha to oversee the Blood Moon pack, a stern but fair warrior from his own guard, until a permanent, worthy leader could be chosen. They would be leaving for the royal citadel, the heart of the kingdom, in the morning. Finn was asleep in a large, soft bed, his silver glow now a gentle, peaceful pulse. Alara felt a hand on her shoulder and turned to see Kalen standing behind her. He had been giving her space, allowing her to process the seismic shifts in her life, but the pull between them was a living thing, a current that was growing stronger by the hour. It is done, he said softly. The first step in righting the wrongs done to you. Thank you, she whispered, her voice barely audible. For protecting him. For protecting us. Always, he vowed. He finally gave in to the urge that had been tormenting him since he first saw her. He gently cupped her cheek, his thumb stroking her skin. The contact was electric, sending a jolt of warmth through her entire body. I will spend the rest of my life making up for the fact that I wasn't there sooner. She leaned into his touch, a silent surrender to the bond that connected them. The fear and uncertainty were still there, but they were now overshadowed by a burgeoning sense of hope. For the first time, she felt safe. But safety was an illusion. Deep within the king's own council, a rot had taken root. Lord Valerius, a high-ranking alpha from an old and powerful family, had watched the events at Blood Moon Pack with cold, calculating fury. He had his own ambitions for the throne. He had been subtly maneuvering for years to position himself as Kaelin's successor, should the king remain mateless and childless. The discovery of the Lunar Queen and her powerful heir had shattered his plans. The prophecy Kaelin spoke of was one Valerius knew well. It was a prophecy of unity and strength, one that would solidify Kaelin's rule for centuries. He could not allow that to happen. If the queen and her pup were to die in a tragic accident, so soon after being discovered, well, the kingdom would be destabilized, the council would demand a stronger hand, and Kaelin, lost in grief, would be vulnerable. Valerius was not a fool. He would not act himself. But he had loyalists, men who owed him everything, planted even within the royal guard. That night, as the Blood Moon Pack slept a troubled sleep, he put his plan into motion. A faint sound woke Alara from a light doze. It was the soft scrape of a boot on stone from the hallway outside their suite. The royal guards Gideon had posted were silent, disciplined warriors. They did not make careless sounds. A primal instinct honed by years of living in constant danger screamed at her. She slid silently from the bed, her heart pounding. The silver light began to gather at her fingertips as she moved toward the main room of the suite, where Finn was sleeping. The door to the suite creaked open. 3 figures in the black and silver of the royal guard slipped inside, their weapons drawn. But they did not move like guards. They moved like assassins. Their target was obvious. They ignored Alara, their eyes fixed on the sleeping form of the child in the bed. Lord Valerius's orders had been clear. Kill the boy, make it look like a tragic consequence of the day's chaos, and dispose of the Omega. The first assassin reached the bed, his dagger raised. He never saw what hit him. Alara was no longer a cowering Omega. She was a queen and a mother protecting her child. A wave of pure lunar energy, cold and brilliant, erupted from her hand. It wasn't a physical blast. It was a wave of force and starlight that slammed into the assassin, encasing him instantly in a layer of shimmering, magical ice. He was frozen solid before he could even cry out. The other 2 assassins spun around, their faces masks of shock. They had underestimated her. They saw not a broken woman, but a silver-eyed goddess radiating lethal power. "You will not touch him," she snarled, her voice the same multitonal echo from the clearing. They charged her. One swung a sword in a wide arc. Alara ducked under it with a feral grace she didn't know she possessed, her own power guiding her limbs. She slammed her palm into the man's chest. He screamed as the freezing energy coursed through him, his heart stopping in an instant. He collapsed, dead before he hit the floor. The final assassin, seeing his comrades fall, let out a roar of rage and lunged, abandoning subtlety for brute force. He was bigger, stronger. He crashed into her, sending them both tumbling to the ground. His hands closed around her throat, squeezing. Black spots danced in her vision. She clawed at his hands, but he was too strong. Panic seized her. "Finn!" Suddenly the pressure vanished. A blur of black motion, a sound like a thunderclap, and the assassin was torn off her. Kaelin was there, a storm of lethal fury. He had sensed her distress through the mate bond, a spike of pure terror that had sent him crashing through the door from his adjoining room. He did not waste time with weapons. His hands, like steel claws, ripped the assassin apart. It was brutal, primal, and over in seconds. He stood over the broken body, his chest heaving, his golden eyes blazing with an apocalyptic fire that made the moonlight seem pale. His beta, Gideon, and other loyal guards stormed the room, securing the perimeter. Kalen turned to Alara, who was gasping for air on the floor. He was at her side in an instant, his hands gentle as he helped her up, checking her for injuries. "Are you hurt? Did they touch you?" "I'm fine," she choked out, her hand going to her bruised throat. She looked toward the bed. Finn was sitting up, his eyes wide, but he was unharmed. The sight of him, safe, was all that mattered. Gideon knelt by one of the dead assassins. "Your Majesty, this is Lord Valerius's man." Kalen's face became a mask of cold fury. "Valerius." He spat the name like a curse. The betrayal from within his own council was a wound far deeper than any blade. He dared to touch what is mine. He looked at Alara, at the fierce, protective fire that still burned in her silver eyes. She had not screamed. She had not hidden. She had fought. She had killed 2 of them herself. Pride, fierce and overwhelming, swelled in his chest. "You were magnificent," he breathed. He turned to Gideon, his voice dropping to a lethal calm. "Find Valerius. Bring him to me. Alive. I want to look him in the eye as I take everything from him." The command was unnecessary. At that moment, Lord Valerius, confident in his men's success, chose to make his appearance. He strode into the room, a facade of concern on his face. "Your Majesty, I heard a commotion. Is the Queen all right?" His eyes fell on the bodies of his dead men, the frozen statue of the first, and the furious, alive and well Queen. His face paled. The trap had failed. Kalen gave him a slow, predatory smile. It was the most terrifying expression Alara had ever seen. "Valerius, how convenient of you to arrive." The Lord tried to bluff, to feign ignorance, but the evidence was laid bare at his feet. His eyes darted toward the door, but loyal guards now blocked his exit. He was trapped. "You coveted my throne," Kalen said, his voice a low growl. "You tried to murder my son. You tried to murder my queen." He took a step forward, his shadow falling over the terrified lord. "There is no punishment in any law, old or new, that is sufficient for your crimes, so I will create one." Kalen did not delegate the task. With a speed that defied belief, he closed the distance. The sounds that followed were sickening, but Alara did not look away. She stood tall, Finn now safely in her arms, and watched as the King of Shadows dispensed his brutal final justice. The threat was neutralized. For now, they were safe. 6 months later. Alara stood on the grand balcony of the royal citadel, a fortress of black stone and silver filigree carved into the side of a mountain. The wind, clean and cold, whipped her long silver-white hair around her. She was no longer dressed in rags, but in a gown the color of the midnight sky, adorned with a simple silver circlet that marked her as queen. The title no longer felt strange. It felt like a skin she had finally grown into. Below her, the kingdom spread out, a patchwork of forests, rivers, and settlements under the light of the twin moons. It was her kingdom now, hers and Kalen's. The people had been wary at first, stories of the long-lost lunar queen seeming too much like a fairy tale. But they had seen her quiet strength, her kindness, and the fierce, undeniable love between her and their king. They had come to adore her. Finn, now almost 5, stood beside her, his hand in hers. He was taller, his twilight eyes bright with intelligence and a controlled power that no longer burst forth by accident. Kalen had begun training him, teaching him to harness the incredible legacy that flowed through his veins. He was no longer a secret to be hidden, but a prince to be celebrated. A pair of strong arms wrapped around her from behind, and a familiar warmth enveloped her. Kalen rested his chin on her shoulder, his golden eyes gazing out at the same vista. The hard, merciless edge he had always carried was still there, but it was tempered now by a deep contentment she knew she had put there. "What is my queen thinking about so seriously?" he rumbled, his voice a soft vibration against her back. "I was thinking about a girl in rags," she said softly, scrubbing a floor in a place called Blood Moon. She turned in his arms to face him, her silver eyes meeting his gold. "I was thinking that she would never have believed this was possible." He cupped her face, his expression tender. That girl was always a queen. The world was just too blind to see it. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. "You saved me, Alara, from a century of darkness. You and Finn. You are my light, my moon, my everything." The raw sincerity in his voice brought tears to her eyes. This terrifying Alpha King, this walking apocalypse, loved her with a depth that still stole her breath away. He had given her a home, a future, and a love she never knew could exist. He had not just saved her from her tormentors, he had helped her save herself. "And you," she whispered, her hand coming up to trace the scar over his eye, "are the shadow that makes the light worth seeing." He closed the small distance between them, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that was both passionate and deeply peaceful. It was a kiss of promises kept and futures yet to be written. It was the seal on their new reality, a world where the rejected Omega was a revered queen, the hidden child was a beloved prince, and the lonely king had finally found his home. A diamond, trampled into the mud, still shines with the fire of a star when held up to the light. Alara had been that diamond, and in the arms of her mate, under the light of the moon, she finally shone with a brilliance that lit up the entire world. Love, she had learned, was the only magic that was truly real.